I was never the paranoid type. I grew up in a small town where people left their doors unlocked, where the biggest threat was a raccoon getting into the trash. But college changed that. Moving to a bigger city made me more cautious, double-checking locks, keeping my phone charged at all times. Still, when my roommates left for the weekend, I wasn't scared. The dorm was quiet, and I had 2 full days of doing absolutely nothing ahead of me. Friday night I stayed up late watching horror movies, ironically. I remember shutting all the windows before going to bed because the forecast said it might rain. I even checked twice. I woke up groggy the next morning, the kind of heavy sleep where your body feels glued to the mattress. It took me a few minutes to notice it. The kitchen window was open. Not wide, just enough for a hand to fit through. My first thought was that I had forgotten to lock it properly, that maybe a strong breeze had pushed it open. The night before was a blur of popcorn, dim laptop glow, and half-dozing through movie endings, so it seemed possible. I sighed, got up, and went to close it, mentally scolding myself for being careless. Then I saw the floor. There were footprints, faint, smeared, but unmistakably there. Muddy prints on the tile, leading from the window to the hallway. My stomach clenched so hard it hurt. I stood frozen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Any explanation that didn't involve what my gut was already screaming at me. Maybe I tracked them in the night before? But I hadn't been outside, and even if I had, I would have noticed stepping in mud. The realization hit slowly, like ice creeping through my veins. Someone had been inside. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe it was just one of my roommates. Maybe they came back late, forgot their key and climbed in through the window. But no, my phone was still on the nightstand, and there were no missed calls or texts. And even if that had happened, why wouldn't they have woken me up? Why wouldn't they have cleaned up the footprints? The thought of someone creeping through the apartment while I slept made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone with shaky hands and texted our group chat. No replies. I checked the time, 7:13 a.m. Too early for them to be awake if they were still out of town. The apartment was silent, but suddenly, that felt wrong. Too silent. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every tiny sound. The hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the walls settling. I strained my ears, listening for something. Anything. My brain was telling me that whoever had left those footprints was gone. But another part of me, the part that was currently making my hands tremble, wasn't so sure. I took slow, careful steps toward the hallway, following the prints. The logical part of me wanted to analyze them, to see if they led anywhere. The terrified part of me wanted to grab my keys, run outside, and never look back. The prints stopped just before my bedroom door. That was the moment I felt true, raw fear. It wasn't just the idea that someone had been here. It was the idea that they had stood, right there, outside my door, in the dark, watching, listening. My mind spiraled. Had they tried the door? Had they stood there for minutes? What if I had woken up? What if I had opened the door? I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, now. But then something else caught my eye. The closet door in the hallway. It was open just a crack. I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't left it that way. I stood there, staring at the closet, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Every nerve in my body was telling me to run, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my mind caught in this awful limbo between logic and sheer panic. If someone was in there, if they had been standing in the hallway watching me sleep, then what the hell were they waiting for? The longer I stared, the more I became convinced that if I reached out, if I pulled that door open, I wouldn't like what I found. I took a step back, then another. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it was rattling my ribs. I needed to leave. But every horror movie I had ever seen was screaming in my head. What if the moment I turned my back, the door swung open? What if I made it to the front door only to hear the creak of slow, deliberate footsteps behind me? My hand shook as I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. 911, just call. Just a noise. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but I heard it. A slow, deliberate inhale, like someone trying to breathe without making a sound. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was coming from inside the closet. For a single horrifying moment, I pictured what was behind that door. Someone crouched in the dark, waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The only thing I knew was that I had to run. I bolted. My feet barely touched the floor as I sprinted for the front door, fumbling with the lock, my fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. I yanked it open and stumbled out into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I pressed my back against the wall, my chest heaving. The building was quiet. The morning sun was streaming through the hallway window like nothing was wrong. But inside that apartment, behind that closet door, someone had been there. I didn't go back inside, not alone. I stood in the hallway, my back still pressed against the wall, my fingers hovering over my phone. My first instinct had been to call 911, but what was I supposed to say? That I thought someone might be hiding in my closet? That I'd heard breathing? I didn't have proof, just muddy footprints and a half-open window. My stomach twisted at the thought of a cop rolling their eyes at me, telling me I must have imagined it. But I knew what I heard, and I knew I wasn't going back in there alone. So I called my friend Jake. He lived in the dorm building next to mine, and I knew he'd come without question. When he picked up, I barely managed to get the words out. I think someone broke in. I think they're still inside. He was there in less than 5 minutes. I don't think I'd ever been so relieved to see someone in my life. Together we stepped back into the apartment, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Everything looked the same. The kitchen window was still slightly open. The footprints were still there. And the closet door, it was wide open. Jake grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and pushed the closet door all the way back, revealing nothing but a few coats and an old laundry basket. Empty. My whole body felt numb. We searched every inch of the apartment, checking under the bed, inside cabinets, even behind the shower curtain. No one was there. No signs of forced entry. No explanation. I felt like I was losing my mind. But as we stood in the kitchen, I looked down at the footprints again. They led from the window to my bedroom door, but not back. Whoever had been in my apartment never left through the window. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was the first time my dad had ever left me home alone overnight, and I was determined to prove I could handle it. I was 16, and he had a work trip that couldn't be postponed. The house wasn't huge, but it felt massive when it was just me inside. A 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a basement I never had a reason to go into. Dad always kept it locked, saying there was nothing down there but old junk and broken furniture. I never questioned it. That night I locked every door, checked every window, and double-checked the alarm system before settling in my room with my laptop. Everything felt normal. Until 3:12 a.m. I wasn't asleep yet. I was scrolling through my phone, half watching a movie on my laptop when my heart nearly stopped. A notification popped up from our alarm system. Front door opened. 3:12 a.m. My stomach dropped. I froze, staring at the screen, my mind racing. I hadn't heard anything, no creaking floorboards, no footsteps. But someone had to be inside, right? I held my breath, trying to listen past the sound of my own heartbeat. The house was silent. Too silent. I slowly sat up, phone clutched in my shaking hand, trying to convince myself it had to be a glitch. But I knew our system wasn't faulty. After a few agonizing minutes, I forced myself to check. Every inch of my body screamed at me to stay put, but I couldn't just ignore it. I tiptoed downstairs, heart hammering against my ribs. The living room was empty. The front door was locked, deadbolt still in place. I checked the back door, the windows. Everything was secure. No sign of forced entry. No movement outside. It didn't make sense. The alert had to be wrong, but I didn't feel any safer. I kept all the lights on and curled up on the couch, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The next morning, daylight made everything seem a little less terrifying. I laughed at myself for freaking out over nothing and texted my dad to let him know everything was fine. But when I walked past the basement door on my way to the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door, which had been shut for years, was open. Not wide open, just barely, but enough for me to see darkness creeping out from the crack. My breath caught in my throat. My dad always kept it locked. Always. I hadn't heard it open. Hadn't even thought about it the night before. But now, standing there, I felt that same suffocating fear from 3:12 a.m. creeping back in. I stood there staring at the basement door, my skin crawling. It wasn't wide enough to see anything inside, just a sliver of darkness yawning open like a quiet invitation. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe my dad hadn't closed it properly before he left. Maybe a draft from the vents nudged it open. But I knew that wasn't true. That door had been locked for as long as I could remember. I would have noticed if it had been even slightly ajar before. My chest tightened. I took a slow step forward, reaching out. But as soon as my fingers brushed the wood, I stopped. It felt wrong, like something on the other side was waiting. I backed away, my heart thudding. If I ignored it, it would go away, right? That's what I told myself. I made breakfast, turned on the TV, acted like everything was normal. But I couldn't stop glancing back at the hallway, half expecting the door to be wide open the next time I looked. It stayed exactly the same, just barely open, like a breath held in suspense. Eventually, I grabbed my phone and called my dad. I tried to keep my voice casual, but he picked up on it right away. "You okay, kiddo?" His voice was groggy, probably still half asleep. Yeah, Did you leave the basement door open before you left?" I held my breath, waiting. He was silent for a moment, then, "What?" "No, it should be locked." My stomach twisted. "It's open." Another pause. "How open?" "Not a lot, just a crack." He exhaled sharply. "Go check the lock, now." I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed to leave it alone, to pretend I hadn't noticed. But my dad's voice was firm, and I could hear the worry creeping into his tone. So I forced my feet to move. Step by step, I approached the door, the air around me feeling heavier with every inch I closed. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. I gave it a gentle push, just enough to see if it would swing open further. It didn't. It stopped like something on the other side was pressing back. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard and tried the lock. It was still engaged. That didn't make sense. If the door was locked, how had it opened at all? My fingers traced the latch, testing it, but it was secure. The only way the door could have opened was if someone had unlocked it, then locked it again from the inside. My pulse pounded in my ears. I stepped back, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. "There's no way," I whispered, more to myself than to my dad. "It's still locked." "What do you mean, still locked?" His voice was sharp now, alert. I hesitated. "Like, it's locked, but it's open." That silence again. Then his voice dropped to something low and serious. "I want you to leave the house, right now. Go to the neighbors. I'll call the cops." I didn't argue. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my shoes, and bolted out the front door, barely remembering to lock it behind me. The cold morning air hit my face, but I didn't stop running until I was knocking on my neighbor's door, heart hammering against my ribs. Mrs. Callahan, an older woman who'd lived next door since before I was born, answered with a concerned frown. I must have looked as freaked out as I felt, because she didn't even ask questions, just ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. My dad called me back within minutes. The cops were on their way. I sat in Mrs. Callahan's kitchen, gripping a mug of tea she'd forced into my hands, but I barely felt the warmth. My mind kept looping back to that basement door. The lock. The feeling that someone had been behind it. Had I almost opened it? Would I have seen something I wasn't supposed to? The thought made my stomach churn. The police arrived not long after. They checked the house top to bottom, including the basement. When they finally came back up, one of the officers, a man with tired eyes and a serious face, told me there was no one inside. No signs of forced entry. No explanation for why the basement door had been open. But then he asked me something that made my blood run cold. "Did your dad ever keep food down there?" I shook my head, confused. "No, why?" He exchanged a glance with his partner before answering. "Because there were empty food wrappers on the floor near the back wall. Fresh ones." I don't remember much after that. My dad came home early and we had the locks changed that same day. He even put a heavy-duty bolt on the basement door just in case. I never slept in that house alone again. We never figured out how the door opened that night, or who, if anyone, had been hiding down there. But sometimes, when I think about it too much, I wonder what would have happened if I had pushed that door open just a little more. I was 17 when it happened, just a regular Friday night in late October. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me alone in the house. Nothing unusual. I was used to it. I had my headphones on, half watching a horror movie while scrolling through my phone. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. We lived in a suburban area, the kind of place where people actually waved to each other but still locked their doors at night. It was almost 10 p.m. when I first heard it. The distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel. At first I didn't think much of it. My dad had a habit of forgetting things and turning back home. Or maybe my mom had called an Uber instead of driving. But when I pulled my headphones off and peeked through the living room window, I felt a strange jolt in my chest. A black sedan sat at the end of our driveway, just barely visible under the dim glow of the street lamp. Its headlights were off, engine still running. No one got out. No movement at all. I waited a few seconds expecting to see the driver's door swing open. But nothing happened. The car just sat there, a silent shape in the dark. A weird feeling started to creep in. If it were someone I knew, they would have come to the door by now. If it were a delivery, I'd have gotten a notification. My stomach twisted as I realized something. There was no reason for anyone to just sit there like that. I backed away from the window, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. Minutes passed, 5, then 10. The car never moved. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was just lost, checking directions on their phone. Maybe they were waiting for someone. But why wouldn't they at least turn on their headlights? The longer it sat there, the more my nerves tightened. I double-checked that the doors were locked, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled and felt my chest tighten. 20 minutes now. The car was still there. I tried to distract myself, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, but I kept glancing at the window every few seconds. The car hadn't moved. It just sat there, idling quietly like it was waiting for something, or someone. I thought about calling my parents, but I didn't want to freak them out over nothing. Instead, I decided to do something that, in hindsight, was probably stupid. I turned off all the lights in the living room and peeked through the blinds again, just enough to get a better look without being seen. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The driver's side window was rolled down just a few inches, and from where I stood, I could barely make out a silhouette in the front seat. They weren't on their phone. They weren't moving at all. Just sitting completely still, facing my house, my breath caught in my throat. Every instinct in me was screaming that this wasn't normal. I took a step back from the window, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed the house phone, we still had one back then, and debated whether to call the cops. What would I even say? There's a car outside my house and it's just there? It sounded ridiculous, but something about it felt so wrong. I texted my best friend Sarah instead. There's a weird car in my driveway. Been here for almost 30 minutes. No one's gotten out. She responded immediately, WTF. That's creepy. Call your parents. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the dial pad. Then, as I stood there, phone in hand, a soft sound cut through the silence. A click. The unmistakable sound of a car door unlocking. I froze. The sound was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. But my gut told me otherwise. I inched back toward the window, careful not to disturb the blinds. The car door hadn't opened yet, but I could see the faintest shift in the silhouette. Whoever was inside was moving now. My throat felt dry as I gripped the phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the call button. Do I call the cops? What if it's nothing? But my body had already made the decision for me. I pressed the button and brought the phone to my ear. Before it even rang, the engine suddenly cut off. The low hum that had been filling the night air for the past 30 minutes just vanished. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could barely hear my own breathing over the sound of my pulse hammering in my head. My eyes stayed locked on the car, half expecting the door to swing open and someone to come rushing out. But nothing happened. The car just sat there, even more unsettling now that it was completely still. The 911 operator picked up. "What's your emergency?" I whispered into the receiver. "There's a car in my driveway. It's been here for almost 40 minutes. I don't know who it is, and they're just sitting there." My voice was shaking. The operator asked for my address, my name, and if I could see the driver. I told her everything, my eyes never leaving that black sedan. She said she'd send an officer to check it out, but just as I was about to thank her, something happened that made my stomach drop. The interior light of the car flickered on for half a second, just enough to illuminate the inside. Just enough for me to see that there was no one in the driver's seat. I blinked, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Did I just imagine that? My hands were ice cold as I gripped the phone tighter. The car had been running. I had seen a silhouette. There was someone in there. But now? Nothing. Just an empty seat. The officer was on the way, but that didn't help the growing sense of dread clawing at my stomach. Every part of me screamed to move away from the window, to get as far from that car as possible. I backed away slowly, my body rigid with fear. But then, before I could fully turn away, the passenger door suddenly cracked open. Just a tiny bit. Not enough for anyone to step out, just enough to send a chill straight down my spine. My breath hitched, my legs locked into place. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing else happened. The night was dead silent. Then, in the stillness, I heard it. A soft tapping on the glass. Not from my window. From the back seat window of the car. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone was waiting for me to answer. My stomach twisted into knots. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but I was rooted in place, frozen in terror. There was no reason for that sound. No reason for anything that was happening. And yet there it was. That's when the porch light flicked on. A pair of headlights swept across the driveway as another car pulled in. My parents were home. As soon as the light hit the black sedan, the passenger door slammed shut. The engine roared to life, and within seconds the car was speeding down the street, disappearing into the night. I stumbled back from the window, my entire body shaking. I didn't know what I had just witnessed. I still don't. My parents barely noticed anything was wrong when they walked in, probably because I was too shaken to even explain it properly. I kept stammering, pointing at the driveway, but by the time they looked, the car was long gone. My dad frowned, asking if I was sure I hadn't just imagined things. Maybe it was someone waiting for a friend, he suggested, or a delivery driver on break. But I knew what I saw. I knew how long that car had been there, how it sat there in silence, how the tapping had come from the back seat. Just as I was about to argue, red and blue lights flashed outside. The police had arrived. I rushed to the door, relief washing over me. I explained everything as best as I could. The car, the silhouette, the empty driver's seat. The officer listened patiently, taking notes, but when I mentioned the light turning on and seeing nothing inside, his expression changed slightly, like he'd heard something similar before. He asked if I got a plate number, but in my panic, I hadn't. I felt stupid. He did a quick sweep of the neighborhood but came back with nothing. The car was gone. "If it returns, give us a call," he said before leaving. I locked every door, double-checked every window, but even after my parents went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made my heart race. I sat up in bed, staring at my curtains, half expecting to hear that tapping again. That was over 5 years ago. I never saw the car again. I don't know who was in it, if anyone was in it. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door, if I had stepped outside, if I had answered the knock. I'm just glad I never found out. I live alone in a small apartment on the second floor of a quiet complex. It's not fancy, but it's home. I work from home, so I don't go out much, and I keep to myself. That night, I had just finished making dinner, pasta with some leftover sauce, when I heard a knock at my door. It wasn't loud or impatient, just a few solid knocks. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a delivery guy standing there holding a plastic bag of food. He was wearing a red insulated vest over a hoodie, the kind a lot of delivery drivers wear. His face was neutral, but something about him felt off. I opened the door just enough to speak. "I think you have the wrong apartment," I said. The guy, maybe mid-30s, scruffy beard, dark circles under his eyes, barely reacted. "Delivery for Emily," he said, holding up his phone. My stomach tightened. That was my name, but I hadn't ordered anything. I told him as much, but he just stared at me like I was lying. "This is the right address," he said, reading it off his phone. He even showed me the screen, my full name, my exact apartment number. I shook my head. "I didn't order anything." He exhaled sharply through his nose like he was frustrated, then shrugged. "Whatever," he muttered, stepping back. "Someone paid for it." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall. I closed the door, locking it instinctively. My heart was beating a little faster than before. Maybe it was a glitch in the app. Maybe someone ordered for the wrong person. But I couldn't shake the weird feeling. An hour passed. I had mostly forgotten about it, busy scrolling on my phone, half watching some crime documentary in the background. Then my doorbell rang. My head snapped up. I wasn't expecting anyone, and after what had happened earlier, a small pit formed in my stomach. I moved quietly to the door, pressing my eye against the peephole. It was him, the same delivery guy. He wasn't knocking this time. He was just standing there, staring at my door, his phone pressed to his ear. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My first thought was that he was calling someone, maybe his boss, maybe the restaurant. But why was he standing there? Why hadn't he knocked or rung the bell again? My phone was on the couch, and as quietly as I could, I tiptoed over to grab it. No missed calls, no messages. Then, as I was staring at the screen, it started vibrating in my hand. An unknown number. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Through the peephole, the man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, phone to his ear. I let it ring. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it through the door. The call ended. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang again, 3 times in quick succession. My breath hitched. He knew I was home. He had to. I slowly backed away from the door, hoping that if I stayed quiet, he would just leave. But then came the worst part. A low voice, muffled through the door. "Emily?" he said. Not a question. A statement. My whole body went rigid. I wasn't sure what to do. Calling the police felt like overreacting, but something was wrong. This wasn't normal. Delivery drivers don't just come back an hour later, don't just stand there calling you from an unknown number. Don't just say your name like that. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, phone clutched in my sweaty palm, listening. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard footsteps. He was leaving. I waited a full 5 minutes before moving. Then, as quietly as I could, I crept back to the peephole. The hallway was empty. I let out a shaky breath, but my stomach was still twisted in knots. I double-checked the lock, then the deadbolt, then grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. Just in case. My rational brain told me it was over, that he was gone, that this was just some creepy misunderstanding. But my gut told me something else, something worse. I tried to go back to my night like nothing had happened, but the unease lingered. Every little sound made me jump. The pipes clicking in the walls, the hum of my fridge, the wind rattling the balcony door. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another call, but nothing came. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Like I was being watched. It was irrational, I knew that, but it didn't stop my skin from crawling. Around midnight, I finally convinced myself to sleep. I left a lamp on in the living room just in case, and locked my bedroom door, not something I usually did. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept replaying the moment he said my name, that flat, almost bored voice. I had no explanation for any of it. And that was the worst part. My mind kept trying to make sense of it, to fit it into some normal box where things like this weren't terrifying. But it didn't fit. At some point, exhaustion won over fear, and I must have drifted off. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up, but something yanked me out of sleep so fast that my whole body tensed before I was even fully conscious. It wasn't a sound that woke me, at least not one I could recognize. It was more of a feeling, a deep, gut-level awareness that something was wrong. I held my breath, straining to listen. The apartment was silent, but the air felt heavier somehow. Then I heard it. A creak. Faint. From the living room. My pulse spiked. My apartment was small, and I knew every sound it made. That wasn't normal. That was footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. My throat tightened as I realized something that made my blood run cold. The chair. The one I had wedged under the doorknob. I hadn't heard it move. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My phone was on the nightstand, but if I moved to grab it, whoever was out there might hear me. My mind was racing. Had I forgotten to lock the balcony door? Was there another way in that I had overlooked? My heart pounded against my ribs as I listened. Another creak. Closer this time. Whoever it was. They were moving toward my bedroom. I had no choice. I reached for my phone as slowly as I could, my fingers shaking. The moment I wrapped my hand around it, another sound made my stomach drop. The handle of my bedroom door rattled, not forcefully, just enough to test if it was locked. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles ached. Then, the rattling stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. And then, footsteps. Moving away. The air in my lungs burned as I waited, listening to every single sound. After a minute, maybe two, I heard the faintest click. The door to my apartment, opening, closing. The weight in the air lifted just slightly, but I couldn't move. Not until I was sure. Another 5 minutes passed before I finally dared to unlock my phone and call 911. My voice shook as I whispered to the dispatcher, explaining everything. They sent an officer right away. By the time the police arrived, the apartment was empty. No signs of forced entry. No sign of the delivery guy. The chair was still wedged under the door, exactly where I had left it. And yet, someone had been in my apartment. The officers searched the building but found nothing. No security footage, no witnesses, nothing. They told me to stay somewhere else for the night just in case. I didn't argue. To this day, I don't know how he got in. I don't know what he wanted. But I do know one thing. Whoever placed that delivery order, it wasn't me. I moved into this apartment about 6 months ago. It's a small one-bedroom in a quiet complex on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, so I spend a lot of time here, alone. It never really bothered me before. I actually liked the solitude, the control over my own space. But lately I've started to feel like I'm not as alone as I thought. At first it was just little things, small enough to brush off. My coffee mug, which I always put in the cabinet next to the fridge, would show up in the one above the sink. My laptop charger, usually plugged in next to my desk, would be lying on the floor, unplugged. I told myself I was just being absent-minded. Maybe I put it there without thinking. Then I noticed my closet door. I never leave it open. Ever. It's one of those habits you develop as a kid. The irrational fear that something might be inside. Even now, as an adult, I make sure to close it before I go to bed. But some mornings, I'd wake up and see it cracked open just an inch or two. Enough to notice. Enough to make me uneasy. I started double-checking at night, making sure it was firmly shut before I turned off the lights. But no matter how careful I was, I'd wake up to find it open again. I started locking my bedroom door at night. It wasn't a heavy-duty lock, just the basic twist lock on the knob, but it made me feel better. If anything was happening, it had to be me. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I even considered setting up a camera, but the idea of watching myself sleep creeped me out more than the alternative. So I tried to ignore it. That worked, until last night. I woke up groggy, confused, and immediately noticed something was off. My phone wasn't on the nightstand where I always left it. I got up, checked the bed, the floor. Nothing. My stomach sank as I stepped into the dark hallway. The apartment was silent, but when I reached the kitchen, I saw it. My phone was lying face up on the counter. The screen was still on, the battery nearly dead. And when I picked it up, my hands went cold. The camera roll was open. And there, in the most recent photos, were pictures of me, taken while I was sleeping. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The photos were taken from the foot of my bed, each one slightly different, like someone had been adjusting the angle. The first few were blurry, as if the camera had been moving. But the last one, God, the last one, was perfectly focused. My face, relaxed in sleep, the blankets pulled up to my chest, and just behind me, near the closet door, was the faint outline of something, someone. I dropped the phone like it burned me. My entire body felt numb, but my instincts were screaming. I ran to the bedroom, flipped on the light. The closet door was open again, wider this time. I forced myself to step forward, to look inside. Empty. Just my clothes, my shoes, the storage boxes stacked against the back wall. I even pushed them aside, checking for any gaps, any crawl spaces. Nothing. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Maybe still was. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with every light on, my back against the wall, watching my bedroom door like it might move on its own. I tried to tell myself it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe I left my phone in the kitchen. Maybe an app glitched and took the pictures randomly. Maybe I was losing it. But deep down, I knew. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had been watching me sleep. At dawn, I called my landlord. I didn't mention the photos. I just told him I thought someone had been inside. He seemed skeptical but agreed to change the locks. That afternoon, a locksmith came and installed a deadbolt. I should have felt safer, but I didn't. I kept thinking about that last photo, about the barely visible figure near the closet. Something about its shape, the way it blended into the shadows. It didn't look like a person. I couldn't stay there another night. The thought of lying in that bed, knowing that something, or someone, had been standing just feet away from me while I slept, was unbearable. I packed a bag and crashed at my friend Ryan's place. I told him some of it, enough to make it sound like I was just paranoid about a break-in. He laughed it off, said I was overreacting, but let me stay anyway. The next morning, I went back to my apartment to grab a few things. The new lock was in place, and everything looked exactly as I'd left it. I felt ridiculous, standing there in the daylight, heart pounding over nothing. But as I was about to leave, I hesitated. I opened my closet one more time just to be sure, and that's when I noticed it. The boxes in the back, they weren't the same. One of them, a medium-sized cardboard box I'd used for old books, was different. It looked newer, cleaner. I reached out and lifted the lid, expecting to see my old college textbooks. Instead, I saw a neatly folded blanket. And under it? A plastic water bottle, an empty granola bar wrapper, a small notebook. My breath caught in my throat. Hands shaking, I opened the notebook. The first few pages were just random scribbles, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My name, written over and over again. Then, underneath, a single sentence. I like watching you sleep. I don't remember running out of the apartment, but somehow I ended up in my car, my hands clutching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I never went back. I broke my lease, left most of my stuff behind, and moved across town. I still don't know who was in there with me, how long they had been hiding, or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching. They were waiting. I was in town for a conference, staying at a mid-range hotel downtown. Nothing fancy, but decent enough. Clean sheets, a working AC, and a coffee maker that didn't taste like burnt plastic. I had checked in the evening before, exhausted from my flight, and spent most of the day in back-to-back meetings. By the time I got to my room that night, all I wanted was sleep. I showered, changed into an oversized t-shirt, and collapsed onto the bed, barely remembering to set an alarm for the next morning. It was just another boring business trip. At least, that's what I thought. I don't know what woke me up first, the knocking or the feeling that something was off. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the alarm clock, 2:07 a.m. The sound was soft at first, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. A pause, then again. Tap, tap, tap. Groggy, I sat up, trying to shake the heavy fog of sleep. Maybe it was a mistake? Someone knocking on the wrong door? I reached for my phone, squinting against the brightness, and saw no messages from the front desk. The knocking came again, this time slightly louder. I slid out of bed, heart picking up pace as I tiptoed to the door. My hotel room was standard. Beige walls, a bolted lock, and a peephole that looked out into the dimly lit hallway. Holding my breath, I pressed my eye to it. There was a man outside. He was wearing a hotel uniform, dark slacks, a light blue button-up, and a name tag I couldn't read through the glass. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of him, like he was waiting for me to open up. "Ma'am?" His voice was muffled through the door. "Housekeeping. I just need to check something in your room." My stomach dropped. Housekeeping? At 2 a.m.? That didn't make sense. I hadn't called for anything. I double-checked the room. No stray towels, no requests on the hotel app. Just my suitcase in the corner and the faint hum of the AC. I swallowed hard and cleared my throat. I didn't request housekeeping. There was a pause, a little too long. Then he knocked again, a little harder this time. Tap, tap, tap. "Ma'am, I just need to check something real quick. It won't take long." His tone was calm, polite even, but there was something off about it. Forced, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a step back from the door and made sure the deadbolt was locked. Then, without really thinking, I grabbed the metal door stopper from the bedside table and jammed it under the door. "I'll call the front desk," I said, louder this time. "If there's an issue, they can confirm." Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from my door. I didn't breathe until I heard them fade into the distance, but even then, I didn't move. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the peephole like he might suddenly reappear. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, my phone clutched in my hand, debating whether to call the front desk or just let it go. Maybe it was a mistake, a weird, late-night mix-up. But the way he stood there, the way he hesitated before walking away, it didn't feel like a mistake. Finally, I dialed the front desk. A woman answered after a few rings, her voice groggy like I had just woken her up. "Front desk, how can I help you?" I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. Hi. I just had someone knock on my door a few minutes ago. He said he was from housekeeping, but I didn't request anything." She was quiet for a second. I could hear typing on a keyboard. "Which room are you in?" 512. More typing. Then her voice came back, sharper now. "Ma'am, we don't have housekeeping staff on duty this late. And we definitely didn't send anyone to your room." My stomach twisted. They didn't send anyone? The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. "Are you sure?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "He was wearing a uniform. He had a name tag." The woman on the other end hesitated. "We only have 2 male housekeepers on staff today, and neither of them are scheduled for night shifts." Another pause. Then, lower this time, like she didn't want to say it out loud. "Did you see his face?" I felt a chill creep up my spine. I hadn't thought about that. I saw the uniform, the stiff posture, the way he stood too still, but I hadn't seen his face. The peephole had distorted the view, stretching his features just enough to blur the details. I tried to picture him in my head, but all I could remember was a vague impression of dark hair and a shadow where his eyes should have been. "I don't think so," I admitted. "I mean, I looked through the peephole, but—" A loud knock cut through the silence. Not from my door, from the end of the hallway. I froze. The knock was slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed down the hallway, stretching the silence between each hit. I didn't dare move. My hand was still gripping the phone, but my body felt like it had turned to stone. "Ma'am?" The woman on the other end sounded distant now, like I was hearing her from underwater. "Are you still there?" I forced myself to swallow, my throat dry. "Yeah," I whispered. "Someone just knocked again, but not on my door." Silence. Then, in a hushed tone, she said, "Can you see who it is?" I didn't want to. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay put. Don't look. Don't move. Don't breathe. but my body worked against me. Slowly, like I was moving through a nightmare, I crept back to the peephole. The hallway was mostly empty. Dim lighting, beige carpet, the same neutral-colored doors lined up in a row. But at the very end, just outside room 520, he was standing there. The man in the uniform. He wasn't knocking anymore. He was just standing still, facing the door like he was waiting for it to open. I barely breathed as I watched him. He didn't shift, didn't fidget. He just stood there. It was unsettling, like he wasn't really waiting for someone to answer, just pretending to. The longer I watched, the more I noticed something was wrong with him. His posture was too stiff, his shoulders too squared, like he was holding himself in place. And his head, it was tilted just slightly, like he was listening for something. I whispered into the phone, "He's at another door, room 520. The woman at the front desk cursed under her breath. "That room's empty." I felt something cold rush through me. "What? No one's checked into 520 in weeks. It's under maintenance." I backed away from the peephole so fast I nearly dropped my phone. My pulse pounded in my ears. The guy wasn't a guest. He wasn't staff. He wasn't supposed to be here. I turned back to the door, listening, waiting. But when I checked the peephole again, he was gone. Panic set in. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a door close. It was like he had just vanished. My hands were shaking as I whispered into the phone, "He's gone." The woman at the front desk was already moving. I could hear her talking to someone else in the background. "I'm sending security up now. Don't open your door for anyone." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My mind was racing. What if he wasn't gone? What if he was still in the hallway, just out of sight? What if he was waiting for me to let my guard down? I grabbed my suitcase and wedged it against the door, anything to feel like I had some control over the situation. It took security less than 5 minutes to get to my floor. They knocked, identified themselves, and I finally cracked the door open. 2 men stood there, real security guards this time, wearing navy blue uniforms. They checked the hallway, the stairwell, even the empty room 520. Nothing. No sign of the man. No record of anyone matching his description on the hotel's cameras. It was like he had never existed. I checked out first thing in the morning. Didn't even bother with breakfast. When I got to the front desk, the woman I spoke to on the phone gave me a nervous smile. "I hope you got some rest," she said. I didn't. I barely closed my eyes all night. As I stepped outside to call a cab, I felt a strange urge to turn around. The hotel entrance was lined with large glass windows, reflecting the street and the early morning sun. But when I glanced at the glass, there he was, standing in the lobby, watching me. I got into the cab and never looked back.